All right, well, why don't we get started? Thank you, everyone who's for attending today. Really appreciate it. I think this is a really great topic. We have a really great event planned on the future of inspectors general, a topic that I think has gotten a lot more attention in recent months and recent years for sure. This one is going to be a little bit different perhaps than our usual LegBranch events. We actually have a special moderator who is also an expert on this topic, so very excited to turn this over to her. Courtney Bublé is a staff correspondent for Government Exec who covers federal management. And before joining GovExec, she also worked for NBC News and holds a degree from George Washington University. So with that, I'll turn it over to Courtney to introduce the rest of our panelists and get going on questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I will introduce our panelists quickly. We have Liz Hempowicz, who's the Director of Public Policy at the Project on Government Oversight, Jonathan Bydlak, the Director of Government Programs at the R Street Institute, and James Christian Blockwood, who's the Executive Vice President of the Partnership for Public Service. Nice to see you all. So my first question, I want to start kind of broad. Can you talk about why inspectors general are important? What do they mean for taxpayers, and why should people who aren't in the media, government, politics world care about them? Jonathan, why don't we start with you first?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think so I come at this question from a lot of perspectives, but one of those I think is the budget standpoint. And I think there's a strong case to be made that inspector general are arguably one of the best things that we spend money on. It's very important, obviously, that government is accountable to people and that we don't waste taxpayer money. And, there's sort of, I think a lot of times, for those of us who work in outside organizations, we think a lot about, our role as kind of the outside watchdog. But I think it's very important to have people on the inside who are thinking about these questions as well. And so, obviously we have GAO and other sort of governmental offices, but oftentimes the insiders have access to information that we are not able to get. And so they can be much more powerful. And, there are estimates, I mean, they vary, but, saying that the, inspector general, spending on inspectors general returns something like $22 for every dollar we spend. I think there are even estimates that have found that, they can potential savings of, 50, 60, 70 billion dollars. So it's a very worthwhile investment, and I think it's very clear that we probably underinvest in inspectors general. And it's a whole host of other benefits we can talk about that I'm sure others will mention, but at a very high level, I think that's one of the most critical.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in, obviously seconding everything Jonathan just said, but I think, we often talk about IGs in terms of kind of the cost savings, and I think that's a huge part of it. And but that's not their only value. Especially I'm cognizant of the fact that now there's all this different polling out there that people are really concerned about government corruption and government actors abusing their power against the people that they're supposed to be serving. And I think that's also a role that inspectors general play. It's not just that they're looking and auditing agency programs, which is a really important part of their work, but they're also, making sure that people within these agencies are not abusing their authority. They also, are looking at whether or not there's mismanagement going on at the agencies, whether or not there's a healthy culture within these agencies themselves so that they're set up to do their job well. So it's both backwards looking in terms of let's get some cost savings here. And then it's also forward looking too. So they make recommendations to the agency on how they can be improving their programs almost in real time. The role that they play within agencies, I think, is just to hit on what Jonathan said, is really important for their access to information, but it's also, I think, really important to highlight that they are independent of that chain of command within their agency. They're independent in that they also report to Congress, not just their agency head. And so, I think they're able to be a little bit more candid about their assessments with what is going wrong and what's going right within these agencies.
If I can just build on what Jonathan and Liz have said, there's different ways to look at IGs. Obviously, there's the corruption angle that Liz mentioned. There's the financial savings angle that Jonathan mentioned. And I come from the good government perspective. So why are IGs important? Because they foster trust and accountability. And that is something that we need more now than ever. They promote efficiency and wise use of taxpayer resources. They give Congress and agency leaders a window into their own performance. And then they have a unique position given their independence, as Liz mentioned. And what do they do for us as the taxpayers, the American public? You can look at the Council of Inspectors General on integrity and efficiency, their recent annual report. And I found the statistics in this report actually quite promising. So out of the 75 IGs across all the federal agencies that consist of the CIGI, or the Council of Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, they've conducted over 3,000 audits and inspections. They've done nearly 14,000 investigations, over 400,000 hotline complaints. And all of this, as Jonathan mentioned earlier, kind of resulted in potential savings of nearly $50 billion. And that's B with, billion. And then the return on investment. I believe their last annual report, Jonathan, was $22, and then more recently, it's now 17. Still very good number. $17 for every dollar invested is a great return. So incredibly important for good government, fostering trust and accountability, as well as helping promote trust and with the American public.
Before I get to the next question, I just want to note that if any of our audience members want to ask their own questions, please use the Q&A feature, and we will definitely get to as many of them as we can. So next question, under the Trump administration, IGs were in the spotlight a lot. There are some high profile removings of IGs, and the former president had sort of an adversity towards oversight bodies, but he wasn't the only president to show opposition to inspectors general, which I think is something a lot of people maybe don't know. So what are some legislative reforms you would like to see to possibly prevent these issues from happening going forward, and can they be bipartisan? Obviously in the Senate, Senator Chuck Grassley, he's been really big on whistleblowers and IGs, and then in the House we have Representative Carolyn Maloney, the Democrat and Republican. But what do you want to see happen from that?
Maybe I'll jump in first on this. I did just testify in front of the House with these recommendations, so I've got them ready to
Yes,
recall.
Please share.
But I think on the first, on the point directly about the president removing inspectors general without kind of, explaining why, or without giving a full explanation of why. Before I talk about the solution, I think maybe I'll just highlight why that's a problem. It undermines all IG's effectiveness if they are worried that, I mentioned earlier that their independence is really critical for them to be candid with their advice and their recommendations to the agency leadership. But it's also really important when you think about their investigative mandate. We can't have inspectors general that are worried at the beginning of an investigation that the end of that investigation might point to somebody who is an ally of the president, and therefore, kind of stop them from doing that work because it might put a target on their back. And so I think one of the most critical reforms that we need to see is making it so that a president can only remove an inspector general when there's cause and when they can explain that cause. And to your question about whether or not this could receive bipartisan support, absolutely, yes. And in fact, we have seen that. In 2008, the House passed language that would do this, give inspectors general for cause removal protections. This was a standalone bill. This was not part of a big package. And so when we look at the vote breakdown there, only 11 members of the House voted against that bill. That means there's broad bipartisan support for these principles. I'd like to see that again. Right now the House has legislation that would do the same thing, but it's not bipartisan, and there's no reason for that. But in addition to for cause removal protections, I think it's also important for us to figure out, how do we address these longstanding vacancies in these offices? Having vacancies and longstanding vacancies too, both puts the office's independence at risk, because when there's a vacancy, it allows the president to kind of choose somebody to fill that office with very few limitations on who they can choose. And they're not subject to those that same oversight by the Senate that happens when we have the advice and consent, when they fulfill their advice and consent role. But they also, I think we saw with the last year that the president, in 2 instances after removing inspectors general, appointed temporary inspectors general who had huge conflicts of interest, that the other job that they were doing at the agency simultaneously, the mission of those jobs were diametrically opposed with the inspectors general role to be an independent watchdog. So I think, addressing vacancies and making sure that there is the right incentive on presidents to nominate somebody that is going to go through this process is really important. And then just 2 other things is I think it's also really important for inspectors general to have testimonial subpoena power. Right now, it's very easy for an official in government to evade accountability by just leaving government service, because IGs can't compel them to cooperate with an investigation once they've left government, which which I think, I don't even think we need to explain why that's a problem when it comes to accountability. And then finally, talking about accountability, it is also really important that IGs themselves are held accountable, specifically when we're talking about giving them removal protections like we are right now. So there is a body that is meant to kind of oversee the overseers. It's the Integrity Committee at SIGI. But right now, I just don't think it's working as well as it can. And so I think that's another area where we need to have some reforms to make sure that these independent watchdogs will be held accountable themselves in a way that is not kind of politically tainted, like we can have when the president just has this unfettered removal power.
So I think there's a lot to unpack there. Liz is quite the expert and provided a lot of information for us. Just for me, starting that, IGs root out a tremendous amount of waste and mismanagement and identify ways to improve programs. It's really important. We could have a healthy discussion or debate around presidents and how they use IGs. I'm not sure I would frame it as opposing them, but certainly we could have a nice, healthy debate around that. I think, this is just a matter of good government, and that should transcend partisanship. I think this is something that we could have bipartisan solutions on. As Liz mentioned, there's a number of legislative reforms that certainly I would support and the Partnership for Public Service would support. That would include looking at firing IGs only for cause and a lot of principles and criteria around that. As Liz mentioned, kind of issues with acting IGs, we want to make sure that they're qualified to be in that role and that they have an independence from the agency and from the president. So requiring that acting IGs come from the IG community is a possible way to do that. And then finally, we want to make sure that our IGs have the resources and the information they need to do their jobs. So there's a number of pieces of legislation out there. They should get bipartisan support. This is something that just makes for good government, and everyone should be able to support.
Yeah, I'll echo everything that's already been said by Liz and James Christian, and just maybe highlight a couple quick points as follow up. If you think about it, the thing that makes IGs so powerful is that they have the ability to be tenacious, right? And so if they are not tenacious, then all of that power goes away. And so the reforms that are necessary are the things that, as Liz pointed out, that it give them the sort of confidence that they can be tenacious without having to worry that someone is looking over their back. And, as someone who is, maybe more from the right side of the political spectrum, I think that's basically as, fiscally conservative or as conservative an idea as you could possibly have. You want this oversight over a federal government that oftentimes can grow too large or can take on responsibilities or things that they maybe shouldn't be doing in their specified roles. The other part of this that I think was mentioned, and this is where, Courtney, you mentioned the Grassley and Peters bill in the Senate, I think is great, is that there's also just that question of, the people who are being appointed into these roles. You don't want, some sort of a lackey, for lack of a better word, to be in that position, because then you can put in place whatever other reforms might impact, when people are actually in the role of IG. But if you don't have someone who really wants to be tenacious or wants to do that job or recognizes the value in it, there aren't any other reforms that are really going to matter. And so it's very important too, I think, that Congress is involved in the process and that at the end of the day, there's no shortage for having people being put in these positions who see the value and understand the value and take it seriously. So to me, that's the crux of this whole discussion.
So our next question comes from an audience member. This person would like to know how reporting requirements for IGs have changed over time. And in this change, have there been any issues in IGs building trust with the public? And what is Congress's role in managing the responsibilities of inspectors general? Whoever would like to jump in first.
Who wants to take it? I don't know that I'm the best person to speak about how reporting requirements have changed over time. My sense is that it does vary a little bit depending on the IG. I think just to on the congressional question, I think that it's obviously incredibly important, right? I mean, my view on a lot of this stuff is that it's good to have some level of adversarial, an adversarial relationship between the branches of government. I think we live in this time where a lot of people talk about polarization, and that stems, I think, from the fact that we have people who in Congress, in the presidency, and so on, who view their entire political identity through the lens of partisanship. But there are actually a lot of other lenses that you could conceptualize yourself as. And the most obvious is, taking pride on being a member of Congress, taking pride in being a member of the executive branch, and sort of having some level of, maybe adversarialness is too strong of a word, but I think there should be a little bit of tension there, because that's where you end up being able to ensure that adequate oversight is happening. The problems occur when you have, domination of Congress by the same party as the executive branch, and then there becomes this tendency to not want to exercise proper oversight. So to me, it's very, very important to have Congress involved in these discussions, and it's important that there's this sort of conceptual view that the body itself is distinct, and that oversight is a fundamental role.
And on the question directly about the reporting requirements, just one small anecdote. A couple of years ago, POGO put out a report at the 40th anniversary of the IG Act, and as we were putting together this report, we pulled together an advisory group of I think it was 5 former inspectors general to kind of run our recommendations by and hear from them. Really, what did you find helpful in your role? What kind of got in the way of you kind of really fulfilling the very important mission that inspectors general have? And they all mention the semi-annual reporting requirements, because over time we just add to these reporting requirements and we almost never take away from it. And I think now what we've ended up with is inspector general offices invest just an incredible amount of resources into pulling together these semi-annual reports for Congress. What we hear from congressional staff is they don't have time to go through those reports, so they're not really being utilized by the Hill, but they are taking up a huge amount of resources from inspectors general offices. So we've recommended that Congress drastically slash some of those semi-annual reporting requirements, not because that information isn't helpful or useful, but the reports themselves aren't helpful or useful. And when I
think we might have lost Liz for a second. That was a great point she was making, though. James, Christian, was there anything you wanted to add on this while we get Liz back?
Yeah, so I can't speak specifically to the change in reporting requirements, but let me just hit a few themes that I think are important. One, there should be dual reporting, right? So it's not just capturing fraud, mismanagement, and abuse, but it's also helping to improve program management and performance management. So working and reporting to an agency head can help do that. And then obviously the oversight component of it is working with Congress. So there should be both of those reporting structures. And as far as format, like how reports are actually communicated, I actually applaud a lot of the IG offices. They're working on their, either summaries up front or the formatting to make information more digestible, readily available, easier to read. They're putting it in digital formats. If you go to oversight.gov, there's a lot of good information there coming from the number of the IGs. And so they should be commended for how they are reporting that information out. To make information more readily available to the public, to agencies, and to Congress. One other thing that I would mention is the relationship and the collaboration piece. Agencies or IGs themselves are not only working with agencies, they're working amongst themselves. So they're sharing information, sharing data, looking at lessons learned, best practices where relevant. And I know, Jonathan, you mentioned that a good healthy adversarial role can sometimes be helpful or beneficial. My words, not yours. I actually see IGs, and when it has worked best is when it's looked at as a partnership, where you have agencies that understand IGs are there to help and to offer them another tool to improve their own performance and to look for mismanagement or abuse or fraud or waste, or become an outlet for people to express any concerns they may have. And so when that's looked at as a more collaborative way, I think that actually improves the overall relationship, obviously, but then better outcomes for the agency and for government as a whole. So again, can't speak specific to how those requirements have changed. Concur with what Liz was saying before she was cut off about semi-annual reports or that periodicity being somewhat burdensome at times. And now that she's back, maybe we can let her finish her thought.
You know, I came in right as you were talking about oversight.gov, and that's where I was going next. So I think you already covered it. But actually, this is just the point I was going to make, is that oversight.gov kind of negated the need for a lot of these semi-annual reporting requirements, because that information is now presented in real time. But I did just want to, Courtney, the question touched also on what is the role that Congress plays in kind of directing the work of inspectors general. And I do think it's important to highlight that the structure of inspectors general, part of their independent structure, is that the agency head is not allowed to direct the IG, or not allowed to direct the IG not to investigate things. That's really important when it comes to the independence of these offices. And so, you know, Congress really does take the central role in kind of determining what an IG's job duties are and what they should be, you know, what work they should be focused on. So that's why I think it's also just incredibly important that there is just this ongoing dialogue between Congress and these IGs, because Congress really does need to understand very deeply kind of the issues that IGs are running into, and also kind of, you know, anything that's getting in the way of them doing their job really well, or in fulfilling that mission, because Congress really is the one that has the power to kind of answer and correct for any problems there.
Great. Speaking of adversarial relationships, I want to switch to pandemic oversight for a second. The CARES Act, enacted last year, established a new inspector general position, who recently published a report alleging, quote, turf battles with the Treasury Inspector General over CARES Act oversight. And the IG, Brian Miller, is looking to Congress to clarify the law, the CARES Act law, that he has more jurisdiction. He went to the Justice Department's OLC to get a formal opinion, which limited his oversight. And I had spoke with him recently for an interview for Government Executive, and he said that he would also like the law to be amended for the American Rescue Plan, so he has formal jurisdiction over that. I'd love your takes on this situation with the pandemic inspector general. I know this is not the first time there has been, quote, turf battles. The Afghanistan inspector general dealt with this as well. But I'd also like your take on pandemic oversight overall. There's several different entities that were created in the CARES Act, in addition to existing ones that are overseeing, you know, this trillions of dollars for this unprecedented pandemic and recession. So overall, if you could touch on that. Jonathan, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, I'll take the latter point. I mean, I think it's fortunate, obviously, that these turf battles are occurring. I mean, I think whenever you're spending this much money, it makes oversight be that much more critical. And obviously, IGs have a really important role to play in that kind of environment. And the analogy I like to make is, you know, actually TARP back in, you know, 2008, 2009. I mean, you know, personally, I was not a fan of TARP, right? And I don't think that was the proper response to the crisis that we faced at that time. However, one of the things I will say is that, you know, there was IGs played a very critical role in minimizing the sort of proverbial, you know, waste, fraud, and abuse that could have happened from that program. And I think that TARP could have been a far worse government intervention if we hadn't had a strong inspector general in that environment. And so I think that the current situation we're facing with COVID relief is the exact same thing. That regardless of your feelings about the underlying, you know, value, or whether we've taken the exact, you know, right tack with respect to responding to the pandemic, whenever you have this much money going out the door, you know, the opportunity, right, for you know, for fraud or for abuse is just that much greater. And so you know, it's frustrating seeing these kind of turf battles because, you know, to James Christian's point, I mean, there should be this sort of collaborative relationship, I think, going on. And, you know, unfortunately, it doesn't always work that way. But I am convinced that having, you know, having strong internal oversight over all of the COVID relief packages is really fundamental. And I don't think you can handedly call yourself a fiscal conservative and not take that view, because all you would be doing is just endorsing, you know, likely, you know, massive amounts of orders of magnitude more of waste than you would likely see otherwise.
And I just want to add to that, you know, Jonathan, I think you're exactly right that looking to TARP and seeing the success there that the IGs were able to play a really big role in kind of mitigating for waste, fraud, and abuse in that package, just makes me all the more, you know, it's making me pull my hair out that the executive branch has been really kind of not setting these IGs up for success. So this started under the Trump administration, right after the CARES Act was passed, when the Office of Management and Budget issued guidance to agencies that basically told them that they were free to ignore the reporting requirements that were included in the CARES Act that would have provided, just massive amounts of data for the IGs to use to do kind of data-driven investigations in the same way that they had been able to do so successfully under the TARP program. But that hasn't been corrected yet. So we still have, we still aren't getting this recipient reporting in the way that we were supposed to. And I guess maybe I'll just highlight, some of the data that was supposed to be collected that is not being collected, just to explain why. The IGs were supposed to receive on a quarterly basis from almost everybody who received any aid under the CARES Act or any subsequent legislation to address COVID, kind of how much money did you receive from an agency? This again is from the recipient entity. How much money did you receive? What was that money for? What did you spend it on? How many jobs were you able to save or create because of this money? All of that information is incredibly valuable to inspectors general, not just in mitigating waste, fraud, and abuse, but also in, kind of being able to go to Congress and say, these programs were most effective at creating or saving jobs. Right now, we're just not getting that information. I think it's just so critical that the administration really correct for this. The further we get out from when this money has left the door, the harder it becomes to conduct this kind of data-driven oversight over it. And I think it's just a really important part, and that's one thing that's undermining effective oversight over COVID relief.
Yeah, and I'll try to answer both parts of this question here, starting with kind of the turf battles. Unfortunately, I don't have any real comments on the specific example you gave with the pandemic recovery IG Brian Miller. But I think what's most important here is that policymakers are getting the information they need to make good decisions, and the public interest is at the forefront of what government does. So turf battles are somewhat inevitable in government, almost in any different type of organizations. The Council of Inspectors Generals on Integrity and Efficiency is an effective IG governing body that actually could help adjudicate some of these disputes over jurisdiction. Ideally, as Jonathan mentioned, as I mentioned earlier, we want IGs working together. We want them working in the best interest of public interest here, and that should be core to the job. But if there needs to be some help with that collaboration, SIGI is one place that might be a good place to go. Now, on how kind of things are going more broadly with the CARES Act, on the IG side, you have the Pandemic Response and Accountability Committee, which has identified financial management, grants and loan management, IT management, among other issues as still some areas that are problematic. And this is, of course, important. When you look at federal agencies that are addressing health and economic crises resulting from the pandemic, the government's distributed over $3 trillion, that's $3 trillion. So having those kind of issues identified by the PRAC are things that we obviously want to work on. Now, there's also GAO, which is not, obviously the IG community there, but the Government Accountability Office. They just recently put out, I believe at the end of March here, a report that identified 28 new recommendations, and then identified that somewhere around 38 of 44 of their existing recommendations previously had not fully been implemented. So those are things that we have in front of us that we could be doing to be a little bit more helpful, right? We could look at the new recommendations and we could fully implement the ones that have already been made. And this is important. Again, GAO identified small business loan fraud, unemployment overpayments, and this unemployment overpayments piece is actually really big. As of March, it was over 3.6 billion. And so when you're dealing with trillions of dollars, obviously billions are within that margin of error. But overpayments of that magnitude are never good, and we should always aim for zero as the goal. And they need more data to determine how much of that will be recovered and et cetera. But still, that 3.6 billion is an alarming number. And then one other area that GAO had identified was collecting, sharing, and communicating vaccine data, which you could imagine at this time is critically important. So I would say overall, from the work I'm seeing from the IGs, the work I'm seeing from GAO, and just the magnitude of this entire effort and endeavor, we are, obviously moving through it. There are places where we can improve.
So now I want to talk about the Afghanistan Inspector General. President Biden recently announced that He hopes all U.S. troops will be withdrawn from Afghanistan by September 11th of this year, which is the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. It's crazy, it's been that long. About a year and a half ago, the Washington Post reported on more than 2,000 pages from, quote, lessons learned. They were interviews done by the Afghanistan IG for reconstruction, as well as hundreds of confidential memos. And essentially, this report showed how U.S. officials weren't telling the public the full truth about what was happening. So I'm curious to get your take about what you think of the significance of this report now that the U.S. will be withdrawing, and what more you'd like to learn from this IG as we head towards September.
I think one big takeaway there is that we should be looking at, government officials in particular right now that are saying now is not the right time to leave Afghanistan. We should be looking at them with some heavy skepticism, because those, as you just said, that reporting shows that our political leadership has not been honest with the American people, not been honest with Congress about how things are going in Afghanistan and whether or not it makes sense for us to stay. And so, I just think that's my major takeaway, that we really should be looking with a heavy dose of skepticism when our military leaders are saying that we absolutely have to stay in Afghanistan. They have not kind of built up the goodwill and trust with the American people in the way that they should have so that we could have confidence in what they're saying.
Yeah, I agree with Liz entirely. This is probably my favorite topic. I could probably talk about this for hours. It's such a great example of so many points. I mean, for one, I think John Sopko, the special IG, is an American hero. I mean, he, to my point from earlier about sort of being tenacious, right? I mean, he took the lead on getting access to this type of information. And doing the type of investigation necessary to really determine whether or not our actions in Afghanistan were consistent with what policymakers and other both executive and legislative branch officials were saying publicly and telling the public. And of course, we found out in part through those reports that that wasn't the case. The other point I'll make here, though, is that we got a question as well I saw in the Q&A about what the role of the fourth estate is here. And I think it's very important to recognize that it was that interplay between the work that was being done by CIGAR, but also the FOIA requests that were coming from the Washington Post, right? That on the one hand, the Inspector General had gathered all this information, they had put out some of it, but not all of it. And part of that was just because of the sort of privileged nature of some of the conversations that they had had. But if it hadn't been for the Washington Post being tenacious in that environment and getting access to that information and really making it public, I don't think today we would even have that knowledge ourselves. And so it's a good illustration of how important that interplay is between different parties, but also how the IGs are kind of at the core of it, right? That at the end of the day, you can have the greatest, sort of most tenacious outside organizations and members of the press and so on, but if you don't have that person or that organization inside doing that kind of work and laying that groundwork, it becomes very hard to really exercise adequate oversight. And I think it's ridiculous that we've been in Afghanistan as long as we have. I don't think that's anything, no one foresaw that. But I think that the ultimate impact of CIGAR will be, I don't think we would be pulling out at the moment or taking the actions that we currently are if the American people had not had access to that information. And that is very heroic in my opinion. And of course, I think others will disagree, but to me, it shows the ultimate power that IGs can have when they are ultimately, not shackled and prevented from doing the kind of, the kind of work that they need to do.
I'll just comment here briefly. So I won't comment on the withdrawal from Afghanistan, whether that's good or bad, and I won't comment on the truthfulness or not of our public officials here. But I will make 3 points, because that's what I think this report highlights for me. And Jonathan already made one of them, which is just the importance of making information public. I think that in and of itself is a very powerful thing. The second is, these findings actually speak to a very critical point, that IGs are not just there to tell you when things went wrong after the fact. Their findings can actually help you see where you can prevent problems from happening, or at least mitigate them to the best of your ability. And then the third point is, IGs are most effective when they have the ears of their government leaders, and this is why it's critical that they have access and are able to go to Congress directly. So I think again, a lot of things to unpack here and to think through, but those will be the 3 points that I think these findings at least raised for me.
And if I can just jump in again, I think both Jonathan and James Christian are touching on, some really critical part here, and that is getting information out to the public and getting information to members of Congress. But as we're talking about the post reporting on this, I just want to, I felt like it was a little bit unfair after that your report came out to kind of characterize Cigar as not transparent. I think especially compared to other IGs, but I think just on his own, has been one of the most effective IGs at kind of making sure that that their findings are getting out into the public and trying to communicate them to Congress. But it does go to show, I think I mentioned earlier that I think a lot of Hill staff, are too busy to read through these semi-annual reports. I think it just goes, it's so important to package this information in a way that's like really easy to digest and understand and turn into action, because I know, from our perspective, a lot of this has been public. It's just been public in these dense reports, which I think, members of Congress certainly should be able to read and go through and make policy on. But I do think, I absolutely think there's a role for press to play here, and nonprofit and non-governmental organizations like POGO to play in kind of communicating these messages to the public. But I just wanted to say, that SCAR has been so transparent, has really kind of been a good model for other IGs on how to make sure that their important issues are being talked about and being well understood.
So now I'm going to go to an audience question. This person would like to know, what are your thoughts on creating a new IG for infrastructure spending? President Biden just unveiled this massive infrastructure plan, which is making a lot of people debate what infrastructure actually means. And I'm going to tack onto that one of my own questions, which is, are there any positions or agencies in the government that don't have inspectors general that you think should? Just a quick example, I did a story a couple weeks ago about a bill that would establish an IG for the USTR office, which has kind of sparked some debate because it's technically within the executive office of the president, and there are several other offices within the office of the president that don't have IGs. So it's a big question I'm throwing at you, but basically, where, if at all, do we need more inspectors general?
I'll just quickly chime in here. I mean, yeah. I think the focus really, and at least I would urge people to focus on making our current IGs successful, and would probably do that over creating new or more IGs. That's not to debate the merits of one new IG in one particular organization or not, but really just to focus on making current IGs more successful. And to a certain extent, that's already happening in a pretty large scale. So there's an organization called the National Intergovernmental Audit Forum. They're actually holding a national conference right now. They convene the audit community, which includes inspectors general, and they work on lessons learned, best practices, sharing information and data, working on methodological approaches. And so to see more of that and to see the IG community continuing to hone their skills and to help themselves better serve the American public is what I would focus on.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. I think, I certainly don't want to go and get into the habit of, every time there's some massive new piece of legislation, let's, tack on a new IG for it. I don't think that's necessary. I think James Christian's absolutely right that there are things that we can do to strengthen the existing IGs. It's very important. On the question of where there could be more IG oversight, I saw we also have a question in the chat about Justice Department and talking about the Judiciary. I mean, I do think that Senator Grassley has been a champion of this as well in his career, and I think this is very important. I will say that I think that I am obviously I think that a strong judiciary is very, very important, and one of the ways to ensure that the judiciary is operating in the way that it should is by having adequate oversight. And unfortunately, there is sort of restrictions in this space that maybe shouldn't be there, and I think that some of Grassley's efforts might be very helpful to resolving. My personal perspective is that members of the judiciary are not above the law either, right? We sort of have this attitude, I guess, this is maybe going a little bit off topic, but I think that the judiciary is somehow, polices themselves in a sense. And I don't think that needs to be the case at all, or should be the case. In fact, I think that we would end up with a stronger judiciary if we had stronger oversight. So that's one area that stands out to me, that wouldn't necessarily be creating a new IG per se, but sort of rethinking the powers that exist in that space.
And I think one way to think about whether or not it's a good idea to create a special IG for the infrastructure package is to look at the package, right, and see where is this money going in the first place? Is it going to existing programs, which for the most part it is? If yes, then maybe we just invest some more money in the transportation IG, who will oversee most of this, because they are existing programs. If it's an entirely new program, like I think we saw under the CARES Act, and that created, and one of the reasons why they created the special IG for pandemic recovery was to oversee this $500 billion pot at Treasury that was a new program. And so I think that's one good way to kind of think through whether or not investing in the existing IGs is the better call, or creating a special IG is like looking where the money is going and where the programs are going. And so for that reason, we are not in favor of creating a special IG for the infrastructure package, but rather reinvesting in those IGs that are already overseeing those programs that'll be getting those kind of plussed up, plus ups in money. And to the question about agencies that don't have IGs that should have them, I don't have a list, but I do think one thing that's important to consider is that there are some agencies that are just very small. And so it maybe doesn't necessarily make sense for them to have their own IG shop if that IG shop is not going to have enough work to do. But one thing that we've been thinking through is whether or not it makes sense to kind of have an IG created that's not within an agency, but has capability to lend out, investigative assistance to, or to cover some of these groups of agencies that are maybe too small for their own IG to make sense. But just because they're small agencies doesn't mean that they shouldn't be overseen and there shouldn't be independent oversight. So that's one recommendation we've made.
Got it. Now another audience question. This person would like to know about how we can increase the talent pool in the pipeline for inspectors general and the oversight community at large. I think this is a really great question. Can this be done through education programs, through fellowships, ways? And I'm going to just add on to this, how to get younger people excited and engaged with, working in the government and in oversight, and also making sure that you have a diverse talent pool. What do you think some strategies are?
So I'll make just two quick points. So I think there are only two things that will attract someone to a position like this, and one is money and the other is prestige. And so I am certainly fiscally conservative. I think that thinking about the talent that we attract is a very critical thing, and in a role that is, as I said earlier, I think we get a lot of bang for our buck. I think it's worth thinking about that. But I also think that the best thing we can do is really ensure that we're implementing reforms that make the prestige of the position itself be something that people want to hold, right? I mean, if you're gonna end up being in this position and you're not gonna really have any power to do proper investigations, or you're always gonna have people looking over your back, undermining the quality of the work that you're able to do, then you're not going to attract, good people to that position, regardless of what you pay, or regardless of what that title is. And so, to me, I have to think about a little bit more about if there are maybe things that we could do with respect to the talent pool specifically. But I think that, in my view, they would be largely secondary to the bigger question, which is, if we make the office be this sort of respected and an office that people across government see value in, that's probably the most important thing you can do to ensure that the people who are going to be in that role are the people you want to be in that role.
But so agree with Jonathan. He highlighted money, he highlighted prestige. I would offer one additional area, and that would just be mission. Right. So even myself being a former career executive in government, I was certainly driven there by mission, and many people that I've come across are mission oriented. And so the opportunity to serve our country, the opportunity to do something positive generally can attract a workforce. To broaden this out a bit, I mean, we know that the government workforce now, the talent pipeline is not as strong as it could be. I mean, less than 6% or so are under the age of 30, which when you compare that to the private sector, that's not as strong as it should be. We have this narrative about public service in general that could be a lot stronger. I think that we have a window of opportunity right now to build upon that. Some of the things that we could focus on is, one, removing some of the barriers and difficulty and complexity of actually applying for a job and getting into the federal government. So that is something on a much broader scale, but certainly would apply to IGs as well. The second is what to do once they're there, right? So the Partnership for Public Service has a public service leadership model, which offers one way to look at approaching the job. And I think more training, more investment, and more tools that allow people to look at what they can do when they're in government would help on the recruiting side of government. And then the last thing that I would point out is we need to be much more diverse in where we look for talent. We would obviously want our officials to represent the society that we have and to be well positioned and bring a lot of talents across a range of different skills to the government. And so looking at having a diverse pipeline, diverse workforce, looking at how we train them and what we do for them while they're in government, and looking at removing some of those barriers barriers to actually applying and getting into government are on a broad scale, what I would say would help. And then the IGs are, obviously a microcosm of that. And I think it would help there as well.
I couldn't agree more with both what Jonathan and James Christian said, and can't improve upon it. So I will just say +1 to everything they just said.
I don't think I've ever heard Liz dole out that compliment before, so I'm going to pat myself.
That's right. I don't throw it out frequently.
Great. So something I definitely want to get to before the hour is up is the topic of whistleblowers. A lot of what IGs do is reliant upon whistleblowers. And it's something else that's been highlighted under the Trump administration, and protections for them, what more needs to be done, if at all. So I'd love to hear all of your suggestions or possible reforms you'd like to see to ensure that whistleblowers, their identities are protected and that they can have safe channels to report allegations of waste, fraud, and abuse too.
Yeah.
Liz?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I care a lot about whistleblowers. I'm sure my co-panelists do too, but I spend a lot of time thinking about this. Yeah, it is really critical that whistleblowers feel like if they come forward, they will be protected, whether that's by the IG or by members of Congress or by outside organizations, if that's who they're talking to, which is a protected channel, I will just say, as long as it's not classified information. But I think one thing that we sometimes lose in the conversation about whistleblower protections is that they aren't so much protections as they are a legal way to try to be made whole after you are retaliated against. And so I think it's just we need to kind of change, I think, the way that we're thinking about it, because I think the way that we talk about whistleblower protections often makes it sound like these individuals come forward and they are protected from the outset, and that is just not true. And so I think it's really important. I think there are a couple things that Congress can do to improve the situation for whistleblowers. One would be to update what is a prohibited personnel practice, or like what can't the agency do to a whistleblower as retaliation. One thing that we've seen pop up time and time again now is agencies investigating the whistleblower after they've made a disclosure, and something that's called a retaliatory investigation that doesn't really have its basis in fact, but is rather kind of this fishing expedition to try to figure out whether or not there is a legitimate reason to take action against this whistleblower that isn't because of their whistleblowing. It's a win-win situation for the agency and a lose-lose situation for the whistleblower. And so what we really do need to make sure that the law accurately reflects and adequately reflects what do we see as common retaliatory tactics. And that is one that is not in the law right now. Another thing is that whistleblowers need access to jury trials. The Merit Systems Protection Board, which is the bureaucratic body that adjudicates whistleblower retaliation complaints, hasn't had a quorum in over 4 years. And so every whistleblower that has come forward within the last 4 years and then experienced retaliation is at the end of a 3,000 plus person line to have their case heard by this body. They have no opportunity to go to court right now, because they have to, they're able to appeal a decision by the MSPB MSPB to court, but they are not able to kind of go from MSPB when they haven't had this final decision and go to a court with a jury of their peers. They're the only segment of the labor market that doesn't have the ability to go have a jury trial when we're talking about things like whistleblower retaliation. And it's long past time for us to address that. And finally, you touched on it, anonymity. And that's why I started by saying, that our whistleblower protections aren't affirmative protections. They are kind of after the fact, and now you can be made whole for this retaliation you've experienced. Anonymity and protecting a whistleblower's anonymity if they want to remain anonymous is the number one way to actually protect against retaliation, because the agency can't retaliate against you if they don't know who you are. It's very easy to understand. Until this became kind of a national talking point during the first impeachment, I don't think this wasn't an idea that was partisan. You go on any committee website on Capitol Hill, and if they have somewhere on their website that says blow the whistle to us, I guarantee they will have something on that page that says, if you blow the whistle to us and want to remain anonymous, we will protect your identity. Because people understand that protecting a whistleblower's identity is the number one way to protect them from retaliation and to make sure that whistleblowers feel comfortable to come forward and blow the whistle. Most of the time, anyway, I'll stop. I could go on forever, but my co-panelists have been very patient with me. But I think those are some of the top three reforms, and there is legislation in front of Congress to do all of this. The Whistleblower Protection Improvement Act, which Pogo has strongly endorsed. It is bipartisan legislation. It is time to get this passed. Let's please pass this, Congress.
I will echo everything Liz said. I think timely adjudication and anonymity are both critical. I think what I'll add is there's also a need for cultural reform here too. It's not just policy reform. I think that to Liz's point, right, this is an issue that's become politicized or made into a partisan one that needn't be. I mean, from my standpoint, again, putting on my budget cap, I mean, whistleblowers are not traitors. They are literally taxpayer heroes. And so these are people who are taking risks to speak up for what's right. So it's not just, me on the outside pointing something out. It's someone who's actually in a position where they are taking on that personal risk, theoretically having a fear of losing everything. And so, I think we as a society should be thinking about it that way and should be highlighting them. My colleague Nan Swift is always fond of saying that the best thing we could do for whistleblowers is build that monument on the National Mall. And maybe that's a little bit tongue in cheek, but I mean, frankly, why not? I mean, there are a few I think people who play an even more important role in sort of the in our republic, the people who are again willing to go and risk what they can for getting out sort of information about improprieties that are happening within government. And so this is a great question, Courtney. I'm really glad you brought it up. And I think, again, I think the policy only gets you so far. I mean, the VA is a great example of that, right? The VA has made policy changes, but there's still, frankly, been this internal culture of retribution. And the only way that agency will end up being reformed in the way that we want is by having, I think, a fundamental cultural shift. And I think that that's true for whistleblowers in general.
I will add here, and again, Liz, obviously all of her expertise on this area, Jonathan, great additions on the culture piece. This is a complex area of law. I don't particularly have, and neither does the Partnership for Public Service. We haven't put forward specific legislative proposals, but what I will say is that whistleblower protections are fundamental to the integrity of our government, right? So the American people are better served with a system that allows them to bring to light instances of wrongdoing or fraud or waste or abuse. The last major updates for anything around this was almost, not quite, but almost a decade ago. And it's appropriate for Congress to revisit this law and see what improvements are needed. One thing I would point out is every year there's a federal employee viewpoint survey and ask employees, do they feel they can disclose a suspected violation, rule, or regulation without fear of reprisal. And over 30% of employees answered in the negative for that question. And so, I think whistleblower protections traditionally have had strong advocates on both sides and is an area around bipartisan support. And so I hope to see that continue and not be distracted by any cultural or political issues. And then to Liz's point about the Merit System Protections Board, that's an important entity. It guards the merit protection system, adjudicates disputes related to federal personnel issues. It has been without a quorum for some time, several years. And most recently, the president has nominated a chair, I believe, of the MSPB, but we hope that all three positions will be filled soon. As Liz mentioned, there's over 3,000 cases in backlog. And I believe around 800 of them are whistleblower cases. So this is obviously important, and we want to get Senate confirmed people on the MSPB. This will help with overall integrity and productivity of our government.
So we're almost out of time, but I do want to fit in one last question pretty quickly. The president is expected to release his full budget next week, and at some point in the coming months, I'm assuming they will release a president's management agenda. And I know a lot of the things we've been talking about require legislative action, but I'm wondering, is there one specific thing you would like to see President Biden do just unilaterally, whether it be executive action, executive order, to improve any type of oversight for his administration? And I know these things can change easily, between administrations, but if you had to pick one thing, what would it be?
Yeah, I think one thing I would love to see is the Office of Management and Budget at the White House kind of issue guidance to agencies that says, please cooperate with your inspectors general. That is one thing that they can do tomorrow that I think would actually make a really big difference. I think agencies often do kind of play some games with IGs and kind of withholding information, and we've seen the problems that can lead to. And then I think the second thing that the president can do, and this is about IGs too, but it goes to Jonathan's point about the monument to whistleblowers on the Mall. I think maybe that might be a couple of years off, but one thing the president could do is hold a Rose Garden ceremony celebrating whistleblowers. This is something that Senator Grassley, kind of the grandfather of whistleblower protections, as he's colloquially known, has been asking presidents to do for decades at this point, and it hasn't been done. And I think it would really go a long way to kind of correcting this narrative that is bubbled up, that whistleblowers are traitors or somehow problem employees that are just trying to look out for themselves. No, Jonathan was absolutely right. Whistleblowers are heroes. They are heroes for taxpayers. They are heroes for good government, and they are heroes for IGs and for Congress. And so I think it's about time that we make sure that message really gets hammered home to everybody who encounters whistleblowers or may encounter whistleblowers.
I would support the monument. I would support the president's letter, or working with OMB to provide support for IGs. Those will obviously be two very good things. President's got a lot of things on an agenda, and so it'd be hard to just point to one thing. But specifically to IGs, my addition on this would be to fill vacancies with confirmed leaders. So this is not new to this administration. It's actually run across multiple administrations. But during a time of a pandemic, tense international relations, potential conflict abroad, economic turmoil, health issues that we have, it's somewhat absurd, and I don't use that word lightly, that I believe the HHS, the State Department, the Treasury, the Defense Department are all without confirmed IGs. And so you can imagine, as they help with improving programmatic outcomes and performance, as well as identify fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement, those would be critical roles right now. I think just more broadly filling those vacancies for Senate confirmed positions would be incredibly important. I believe there's already 12 that are acting right now, which is good, but we believe that acting officials tend to be able to help in some short-term aspects, but making credible, long-term confirmed leaders tend to have an ability to perform more transformational work over time. And so, again, I support Liz's idea of a monument and Jonathan's idea of a monument, support a letter from the president or from OMB supporting IGs. And my one addition would be to appoint Senate confirmed positions for the dozen or so vacant ones that we have, particularly those that are critical for what's going on in our society right now.
And let me just jump in to say, absolutely, yes, that should probably have been my number one recommendation, that fill these vacant IG offices. I think, yes, so thank you, James.
Yeah, these are great ideas, and 3 for the monument. So that's I'll start writing that later today. I know Dan will be very pleased to hear that. You know, I'm obviously not as much of a fan maybe as you know, of executive orders for sure, but I think the other point I'll just make is that I think setting a good example is very critical. So things like, you know, releasing visitor logs, for example, which have been, you know, maybe a source of, there's been a little bit of hesitancy perhaps in the last couple months. I think things like that, there's no substitute for showing how much you care about adequate oversight than illustrating it. And so things like that, you know, aren't just sort of dictating what other parts of government should do, but really showing that you care about it in the own area that you most directly control, I think is really, really important. So that might be my idea. Although, again, you know, any one of these ideas I think would be fantastic things that we should be talking about.
Great. Well, it's 1 o'clock. We're out of time. This was such a great discussion. James, Christian, Liz, Jonathan, thank you so much. Thank you to our audience members for joining us. Thank you again.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Courtney, for moderating. Really fantastic. We'll have to do this again. And thank everyone who tuned in, and please join us next month. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.